What if the Mongol Empire never fragmented? The largest contiguous land empire in human history stretches from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. Genghis Khan's grandson sits in Karakorum, coordinating administration across territories that encompass a quarter of the world's population. The year is one that never existed in our timeline, but in this reality, the succession crisis that historically tore the Mongol Empire apart has been avoided. The Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol nobility, has established a clear line of succession with institutional mechanisms that prevent the fracturing. What follows is not the story of 4 separate khanates drifting into independence, but the consolidation of the greatest centralized power structure the medieval world has ever seen. The historical fragmentation began with disputes over succession after the death of Genghis Khan's son Ogadai. Competing claims, geographical distance, and the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories from a single center led to the emergence of the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan Dynasty as effectively independent states. But in our scenario, a constitutional framework emerges, perhaps formalized during Ogadai's own reign, that creates a federal structure rather than a fractured one. Regional governors, drawn from Genghis Khan's bloodline and trusted generals, maintain significant autonomy, but owe ultimate allegiance to a central authority. The Yasa, the legal code established by Genghis Khan, becomes not just military law but the foundation of imperial administration, standardized across all territories. The immediate consequence is military cohesion that historically disappeared. The Mongol armies, instead of sometimes fighting each other as the Khanates did, remain unified under coordinated command. The conquest that historically stalled continues. Europe, having narrowly avoided complete subjugation when the Mongols withdrew due to succession disputes, now faces a renewed and sustained campaign. The Hungarian plains, perfect for cavalry warfare, become the staging ground for deeper penetration into the continent. Poland falls completely, not just raided but occupied and integrated into the empire. The German principalities, fragmented and unable to coordinate effective resistance, are conquered piecemeal. The Holy Roman Empire, already a loose confederation, collapses under the weight of Mongol military superiority. The composite bow, superior mobility, and tactical sophistication of Mongol warfare overwhelms the feudal armies of Europe. Knights in heavy armor are outmaneuvered. Castles are besieged with siege weaponry imported from China, and the psychological terror of Mongol reputation precedes them. France becomes the line of resistance. The terrain is less favorable for cavalry. The kingdom is more centralized than the German lands. And by this point, European powers understand the existential threat they face. A massive coalition forms, backed by papal authority declaring a crusade against the Mongol invasion. This is total war in a way Europe hasn't experienced since the fall of Rome. Every able-bodied man is conscripted. Scorched earth tactics are employed. The French fight with the desperation of people who know what Mongol conquest means, having heard the stories from refugees fleeing Eastern Europe. The conflict is brutal and protracted. The Mongols face supply line challenges deeper into Europe, and the terrain negates some of their tactical advantages. But the unified empire can draw on resources from China, from Persia, from the Russian principalities. They rotate armies, bring in fresh troops from the steppes, and adapt their tactics to European conditions. They recruit European infantry as auxiliary forces, using conquered populations against those still resisting. The siege of Paris becomes legendary, lasting years, devastating the surrounding countryside. Eventually, through attrition and superior resources, The Mongols prevail. France is conquered. The Iberian kingdoms, geographically isolated, negotiate tributary status rather than face invasion. England, protected by the Channel, remains independent but pays tribute and provides hostages to ensure compliance. By the end of this extended campaign, virtually all of continental Europe west of the Atlantic is under Mongol imperial control. The map is redrawn entirely. The implications for European civilization are profound. The Catholic Church, having lost the protection of secular powers, faces a crisis. The Pope, no longer backed by armies, must negotiate with Mongol authorities, who practice religious tolerance as a matter of policy. The Mongols, pragmatic administrators, allow Christianity to continue, but tax it, regulate it, and subordinate it to imperial authority. Bishops become imperial appointees, selected for loyalty to the Khan, as much as devotion to Christ. This administrative Christianity, stripped of political power, develops differently than in our timeline. Without the ability to suppress heresy through state violence, theological diversity flourishes, but so does religious fragmentation. The economic integration is unprecedented. The Silk Road, already thriving under Mongol protection in our timeline, now extends directly to the Atlantic coast. Goods flow from China to England without crossing a single hostile border. The tariff system is standardized across the entire empire. Merchants travel with imperial safe passage guarantees. The volume of trade increases exponentially. Chinese silk, porcelain, and paper reach European markets in quantities previously unimaginable. Persian carpets, Indian spices, and Russian furs move east. European wool, wine, and later manufactured goods flow to Asian markets. This economic integration drives technological exchange at an accelerated pace. Printing technology from China reaches Europe centuries earlier than in our timeline. Gunpowder weapons, already used by the Mongols, become standardized across the empire. Chinese agricultural techniques are introduced to European lands, increasing crop yields. Persian administrative practices influence European governance. The intellectual exchange is equally profound. Arabic mathematical and scientific knowledge, preserved and expanded in the Islamic world, flows freely to European scholars who are now part of the same political entity. The administrative structure the Mongols implement is a hybrid drawn from all their conquered territories. Chinese bureaucratic examination systems are adapted to select administrators across the empire. Persian record-keeping and accounting methods become standard. The Yasa provides the legal framework, but local laws are permitted as long as they don't contradict imperial authority. A class of multilingual administrators emerges, often recruited from conquered populations, who manage the day-to-day governance of this vast empire. The Mongol elite become less a purely nomadic warrior class and more a cosmopolitan aristocracy, maintaining military traditions but embracing the cultural sophistication of their subjects. The capital remains initially at Karakoram, but the practical challenges of governing an empire stretching across half the world's longitude necessitate administrative innovations. A system of regional capitals emerges. Beijing serves as the administrative center for East Asia. Samarkand manages Central Asia and the Persian territories. A European capital is established, perhaps Vienna or Budapest, managing the Western territories. These are not independent khanates, but integrated administrative divisions, connected by the imperial courier system that enables communication across the empire faster than any previous civilization achieved. The courier system, the YAM, becomes the neural network of the empire. Stations positioned every few dozen miles provide fresh horses, food, and rest for messengers. Information can travel from Beijing to Vienna in weeks, rather than months or years. This communication speed enables centralized control that shouldn't be possible at this technological level. Tax collection, military coordination, and legal administration all function through this network. The YAM stations evolve into nodes of commerce and information exchange, with towns growing around major junctions. The population movements are enormous. Mongol policy of relocating craftsmen, engineers, and skilled workers across the empire to wherever their skills are needed creates a cosmopolitan mixing unprecedented in history. Chinese engineers build irrigation systems in Persia. Persian architects design buildings in Europe. European metalworkers are relocated to Mongolia to improve weapon manufacturing. These forced relocations, while often traumatic for those relocated, create technology transfer and cultural mixing that accelerates innovation. The religious landscape transforms dramatically. The Mongol tradition of religious tolerance, rooted in shamanic pluralism and pragmatic governance, becomes imperial policy. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and local religions all receive state protection as long as they acknowledge imperial authority. This creates a competitive religious marketplace where faiths must appeal to converts through persuasion rather than rely on state enforcement. Islam, already widespread in Central Asia and Persia, spreads more slowly into Europe than in our timeline because it lacks the advantage of being the conqueror's religion. Christianity fragments into numerous sects without a unified church hierarchy to enforce orthodoxy. Buddhism gains followers in Western Asia and even some European converts, something that never occurred historically. This religious diversity creates philosophical and theological exchange. Christian scholars debate with Muslim theologians, Buddhist monks, and Confucian philosophers. The intellectual discourse is unprecedented. Universities that historically were church-controlled become more secular institutions, often funded by imperial grants or wealthy merchants. The curriculum expands beyond theology to include natural philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and practical arts. The empire needs trained administrators, engineers, and doctors, and education becomes increasingly meritocratic rather than aristocratic. The absence of the nation-state system that defined European history has profound consequences. Without the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, the Italian Wars, and countless other conflicts that consumed resources and lives, population and wealth accumulate differently. But this doesn't mean peace. The Mongol Empire faces internal conflicts, regional rebellions, succession disputes, and external threats. The difference is, these conflicts occur within an imperial framework, rather than between sovereign states. Japan remains outside the empire, having successfully repelled Mongol invasions historically through combination of defensive preparation and fortunate weather. In this timeline, with greater imperial resources available, subsequent invasion attempts might succeed, or Japan might accept tributary status to avoid invasion. Southeast Asia faces similar pressure. The empire's southern expansion brings conflict with the kingdoms of Vietnam, Thailand, and Burma. These regions, with terrain unsuited to cavalry warfare, resist successfully for a time, but gradually the empire's resources and persistence prevail. The Mongol Empire becomes truly transcontinental, controlling the entire Eurasian landmass except for the peripheral regions of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Indian subcontinent. India presents a unique challenge. The Delhi Sultanate, already established before the Mongol conquests, controls northern India with significant military capability. The Mongols historically raided but never fully conquered India. In this timeline, the unified empire directs sustained campaigns against the subcontinent. The wars are lengthy and costly, but eventually the resources of the entire empire overwhelm Indian resistance. The conquest of India brings the empire control of incredibly wealthy territories and adds another major population center to the imperial domain. With India incorporated, the empire controls nearly half the world's population and the vast majority of the Old World's wealth. The economic implications are staggering. The Indian Ocean trade networks, the Silk Road, and the Mediterranean commerce all fall under single political authority. Trade barriers essentially disappear. The accumulation of capital accelerates. Banking and financial instruments develop sophisticated mechanisms to handle transactions across vast distances. Bills of exchange, credit systems, and early forms of banking transcend local operations to become empire-wide institutions. The technological implications of this unified, connected world are where the timeline diverges most dramatically from our own. Innovations that historically took centuries to spread now disseminate in decades. The scientific revolution that occurred in Europe during the Renaissance happens earlier and across a broader geography. Chinese inventiveness, Islamic scientific tradition, and European intellectual curiosity combine in unprecedented ways. Observational astronomy advances rapidly, drawing on instruments and techniques from multiple traditions. Medicine benefits from the exchange of knowledge between Chinese, Islamic, and European practitioners. Surgical techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and diagnostic methods all improve through this synthesis. The printing press, arriving in Europe much earlier, has revolutionary impact. Literacy increases across all social classes. Books become cheaper and more available. The standardization of languages accelerates as printed materials establish grammatical and spelling conventions. However, linguistic diversity remains high. The empire doesn't impose a single language, but instead creates a class of multilingual administrators and merchants. Latin, Arabic, Persian, Chinese, and Mongolian all serve as lingua francas in different regions, with educated people often speaking 3 or 4 languages. The military technology evolution is particularly significant. Gunpowder weapons, refined through empire-wide collaboration between Chinese inventors, Islamic metallurgists, and European innovators, advance rapidly. Firearms become more reliable, more powerful, and more common. Artillery develops sophistication far earlier than in our timeline. The Mongols, recognizing that firearms represent the future of warfare, even as they maintain their cavalry traditions, invest heavily in gunpowder technology. By the time period corresponding to our 15th century, the imperial armies are equipped with firearms that rival or exceed those used in Europe 2 centuries later in our timeline. This military technological edge makes the empire nearly invincible. The cavalry tactics that built the empire are supplemented with gunpowder weapons, creating combined arms forces more sophisticated than anything the ancient world produced. The imperial army becomes a professional, standing force rather than a feudal levy system. Soldiers are trained, equipped, and paid by the central government. Military academies teach tactics, strategy, and engineering. The empire maintains security across its vast territories through a combination of military force, economic integration, and administrative competence. But security creates complacency, and complacency creates vulnerability. The empire's very success becomes a challenge. The Mongol elite, originally nomadic warriors, become increasingly urbanized and sophisticated. They adopt the luxuries and customs of their subjects. The warrior ethos that built the empire fades over generations. The armies, while professional and well-equipped, lack the hunger and mobility of the original Mongol horsemen. The administrators, skilled in governance, lack the ruthless efficiency of the early conquerors. Regional identities, while subordinate to imperial authority, never disappear. A Chinese scholar may serve the Khan loyally, but still considers himself Chinese. A Persian merchant may prosper under Mongol rule, but maintains Persian cultural identity. European peasants pay their taxes and follow imperial law, but speak their local languages and practice their local customs. The empire is unified politically and economically, but diverse culturally. This diversity is both strength and weakness. It creates vibrancy and innovation, but also potential fracture lines. The succession system, which prevented the historical fragmentation, comes under strain over time. Disputes over interpretation of succession laws create factions within the imperial court. Regional governors, commanding significant military and economic resources, develop independent power bases. The balance between central authority and regional autonomy requires constant negotiation and occasional military enforcement. Several times in the empire's history, succession crises threaten civil war, but each time institutional mechanisms and compromise prevent complete breakdown. The empire's relationship with the periphery evolves. Scandinavia, never conquered, develops as a trading partner and occasional military threat. Viking longships, adapted for naval warfare, raid imperial coastal territories. The empire, dominant on land, never develops naval capabilities comparable to its land forces. The Baltic and North Sea remain contested waters. The British Isles, paying tribute but essentially independent, become a refuge for European dissidents and rebels. A distinct British identity emerges, defined partly in opposition to Mongol rule on the continent. Sub-Saharan Africa remains largely outside the empire's direct control, though trade networks extend imperial influence into East Africa and across the Sahara. The African kingdoms south of the Sahara trade gold, ivory, and slaves to the empire, but maintain independence. The empire's focus remains on the wealthy, populous regions of Eurasia. Africa's resources are exploited through trade rather than conquest. The Americas remain unknown to the Old World for longer in this timeline. The historical European exploration was driven partly by the desire to find trade routes to Asia that bypassed Ottoman control of traditional routes. In this timeline, with the Silk Road secure under Mongol control, the economic incentive for oceanic exploration is reduced. However, the technological capacity for such exploration develops earlier due to accelerated technological progress. Eventually, perhaps driven by curiosity rather than economic necessity, expeditions from Imperial China or from independent Britain discover the Americas. When contact with the Americas finally occurs, the consequences are catastrophic for indigenous populations. The diseases that historically devastated American civilizations are carried by explorers from an even larger, more interconnected population than in our timeline. The die-off is proportionally worse. The civilizations of the Americas, sophisticated and populous in their own right, collapse under the weight of smallpox, measles, and other old-world diseases even faster than historically occurred. The empire moves to incorporate the Americas into its domain. Colonization proceeds from multiple directions simultaneously, with expeditions launched from China, crossing the Pacific, and from Europe, crossing the Atlantic. The Americas become another frontier, another set of territories to be administered, another source of wealth and resources. The silver mines of South America, the agricultural potential of North America, and the geographical position of the continents all get absorbed into the imperial system. But this expansion to truly global scale strains the empire to breaking point. The communication networks that worked across Eurasia struggle with the Atlantic and Pacific barriers. The time lag for messages to reach the Americas and return makes effective central control nearly impossible. The American territories function with high degrees of autonomy by necessity. They send tribute and acknowledge the Khan's authority, but day-to-day governance is essentially independent. The empire by this period has lasted for centuries, far longer than the historical Mongol Empire. It has transformed from a nomadic confederation into a sophisticated, bureaucratic state. The Mongol identity itself has evolved, absorbed elements from all the cultures under its rule. The concept of being Mongol has become political rather than ethnic, a matter of loyalty to the empire rather than bloodline. This creates both strength, a broader base of support, and weakness, a dilution of the original identity that provided cohesion. Technological progress continues accelerating. The proto-industrial revolution begins earlier, driven by the large integrated market and the accumulation of capital. Manufacturing techniques improve. Water and wind power are harnessed more efficiently. Coal mining expands to fuel growing industries. The textile industry mechanizes. Iron production increases, and transportation infrastructure improves with better roads and canals. These developments occur across the empire, not concentrated in one region, as historically in Britain. The social changes accompanying this economic transformation create tension. A merchant class grows wealthy through trade and manufacturing, challenging the traditional aristocracy of Mongol warriors and Chinese scholar officials. Urban populations swell as people leave agricultural labor for industrial work. Traditional social structures strain under these changes. The empire, built on military conquest and maintained through administrative efficiency, must adapt to an increasingly commercial, urban, industrial society. Intellectual developments accelerate alongside technological changes. The scientific method, emerging from the synthesis of empirical observation and mathematical reasoning, becomes codified. Natural philosophy transforms into recognizable science. The understanding of physics, chemistry, and biology advances through empire-wide collaboration. Observatories in China, Persia, and Europe share astronomical observations. Medical schools exchange cadavers and research findings. The printing press ensures rapid dissemination of new knowledge. This intellectual flourishing creates its own challenges for imperial authority. Scientific inquiry raises questions about religious doctrine. Astronomical observations undermine geocentric cosmologies, central to multiple religious traditions. Anatomical studies conflict with religious teachings about the body and soul. The empire's policy of religious tolerance prevents the violent suppression of scientific inquiry that occurred historically in Europe, but religious authorities still resist findings that challenge their teachings. Political philosophy also develops in new directions. Thinkers begin questioning the foundations of imperial authority. If the Khan rules by the mandate of heaven, what happens when the empire faces disasters or military defeats? If the Yasa provides justice, why do regional laws still exist? Questions of rights, governance, and the relationship between ruler and ruled begin to emerge. These ideas, disseminated through printed books, circulate widely despite imperial censorship efforts. The empire faces external challenges as well. On the frontiers, new powers emerge. In Southeast Asia, kingdoms that successfully resisted incorporation grow stronger. In sub-Saharan Africa, states enriched by trade with the empire develop significant military capabilities. On the steppes beyond imperial control, nomadic peoples, displaced or independent, remain threats. The empire must maintain large military forces on multiple frontiers, straining resources and requiring continued taxation that creates domestic resentment. Economic inequality within the empire grows as mercantile capitalism develops. The benefits of trade and industrialization concentrate in urban centers and among merchant classes. Rural populations, still the majority, see little benefit and bear heavy tax burdens. Regional economic disparities increase. Some areas, positioned advantageously for trade or possessing valuable resources, prosper. Others stagnate or decline. These economic tensions map onto ethnic and regional identities, creating potentially explosive combinations. The empire's administrative system, sophisticated as it is, struggles to manage this complexity. Corruption becomes endemic as officials at all levels exploit their positions. The examination system that selects administrators, while meritocratic in theory, becomes dominated by those wealthy enough to afford the education required. Regional governors accumulate power and wealth, becoming semi-independent potentates. The central government's authority over distant provinces becomes more theoretical than actual. Several times in the empire's later history, major rebellions threaten its existence. A religious movement in Europe, combining Christian millennialism with resentment of Mongol rule, sparks a widespread uprising. A regional governor in Persia, commanding significant military forces, declares independence and must be subdued through years of warfare. A succession dispute leads to civil war between competing claimants, devastating several provinces. Each time, the empire survives through a combination of military power, administrative flexibility, and compromise. But each crisis leaves it weaker. The question becomes not whether the empire will eventually fragment, but when and how. Some scholars argue that the empire has become too diverse, too large, too complex to hold together indefinitely. Others insist that the economic integration and institutional structures provide sufficient cohesion. The debate is not merely academic, it's political. Factions within the empire advocate for different futures. Conservatives want to maintain traditional structures and central authority. Reformers push for greater regional autonomy and political liberalization. Revolutionaries, influenced by developing political philosophy, advocate for completely new forms of government. The technological trajectory continues accelerating. Steam power, developed through collaboration between Chinese, European, and Islamic engineers, begins replacing water and wind power. Factories grow larger and more productive. Railways, initially built to transport military supplies, expand to serve commercial purposes. The telegraph, invented by combining knowledge of electricity from multiple scientific traditions, enables near instantaneous communication across vast distances. These technologies begin to mitigate the distance problems that plagued earlier imperial administration. But technology also empowers dissent. Printing presses produce not just official documents, but underground newspapers and pamphlets questioning imperial authority. The telegraph enables coordination of resistance movements across regions. Railways move not just troops and goods, but also ideas and agitators. The empire's own infrastructure becomes tools for those who would transform or destroy it. The imperial court, now located in a purpose-built capital positioned centrally in Eurasia, becomes a baroque labyrinth of factions, conspiracies, and competing interests. The Khan, descended from Genghis through centuries of succession, is less absolute monarch and more arbiter between competing power blocks. The military, the bureaucracy, the merchant guilds, regional governors, and religious authorities all vie for influence. The court's decision-making becomes sclerotic, unable to respond effectively to rapid social and economic changes. Meanwhile, on the peripheries and beyond, alternatives emerge. In Britain, a parliamentary system develops that, while formally acknowledging imperial overlordship through tribute payments, functions as an independent state. The British model, combining monarchy with representative institutions, attracts attention across the empire. In Scandinavia, a confederation of kingdoms and republics maintains independence and develops its own distinct political culture. These periphery states, free from direct imperial control while benefiting from trade with the empire, become laboratories for political innovation. The question of the empire's future becomes urgent when a succession crisis coincides with economic depression and military defeat on the frontier. Multiple claimants to the throne emerge, each backed by different factions. The economy, integrated across the vast empire, proves vulnerable to cascading failures. A financial crisis in one region spreads rapidly to others through the banking networks. Unemployment rises, trade contracts and tax revenues decline. On the frontiers, a coalition of independent states inflicts a significant military defeat on imperial forces, exposing the empire's military vulnerabilities. The crisis creates opportunities for those who want to reshape the empire. Reform movements grow bolder, demanding political representation, legal rights, and limits on imperial authority. Revolutionary movements, advocating complete overthrow of the imperial system, gain support among urban workers and impoverished peasants. Regional governors face a choice between supporting the central government, declaring independence, or throwing support behind reform or revolution. Some governors choose independence, declaring their regions sovereign states. Others support reform, demanding a constitutional framework that limits the Khan's power and grants regions autonomy. Still others back the most conservative claimant to the throne, hoping to restore traditional authority. The empire fractures not along the historical lines of Golden Horde, Ilkhanate, Chagatai, and Yuan, but along new divisions shaped by centuries of integrated development, cultural mixing, and economic transformation. But this fragmentation is not complete. The centuries of integration have created bonds that mere political crisis cannot entirely break. Trade networks persist across newly formed borders. Financial institutions operate across multiple jurisdictions. Intellectual and scientific communities maintain collaboration. The transportation and communication infrastructure physically connects the territories. Former imperial subjects share languages, cultural references, and historical memories. The political fragmentation occurs within a context of continued economic and cultural connection. Several competing political entities emerge from the crisis. A reformed empire, reduced in size but reorganized with constitutional limits on the Khan's power and representative institutions, controls the core territories of Central Asia and Mongolia. A Chinese confederation, asserting independence but maintaining close economic and cultural ties to the reformed empire, controls East Asia. A Persian republic, established through revolution, governs the Middle East. A European federation, combining former imperial provinces with independent periphery states, creates a new political entity in the West. India fragments into several competing states. These post-imperial entities compete and cooperate in complex ways. They fight wars over borders and resources. They form alliances and trade agreements. They compete for scientific and technological supremacy. But they do so within a shared historical and cultural context shaped by centuries of imperial unity. The world that emerges is neither the unified empire of the past nor the fragmented chaos of total collapse. It's something new, a multipolar system of states bound together by history, economics, and culture, while politically independent. The technological progress continues, perhaps accelerates, as competition between the successor states drives innovation. Each entity wants to prove its superiority, to demonstrate that its political system is optimal. This competition fuels scientific research, industrial development, and military innovation. The world enters a phase of rapid change, where the balance of power shifts constantly and the boundaries between states remain fluid. But beneath the surface of competition, deeper forces are at work. The integrated economy of the former empire has created dependencies that political boundaries cannot eliminate. A state that tries to be completely self-sufficient finds itself falling behind economically. The scientific communities, accustomed to collaboration, resist political attempts to isolate knowledge. Cultural exchanges continue, despite official tensions. The infrastructure of roads, railways, and telegraph lines physically connects territories, regardless of who governs them. Then, something unexpected happens that nobody in any of the successor states predicted. The telegraph networks, expanded and improved since the empire's fragmentation, begin showing anomalous behavior. Messages arrive that were never sent. Signals appear on lines that are not connected to any transmitter. Initially dismissed as equipment malfunction, the pattern becomes too consistent to ignore. The signals, when decoded, contain information that shouldn't be accessible. Researchers across multiple successor states, investigating independently, discover the same thing. The telegraph network, spanning the entire former empire and beyond, has become something more than a communication system. The complexity of the network, the volume of messages passing through it constantly, has created emergent properties. The system processes information, makes connections, exhibits behaviors that seem intentional. This shouldn't be possible with the technology available, but the evidence is undeniable. What exactly the network has become is unclear. Some believe it's merely a complex feedback system, creating the illusion of intelligence. Others insist it represents a genuinely new form of consciousness, artificial and distributed. Religious leaders debate whether it has a soul. Philosophers argue about whether it's truly aware or simply a sophisticated mechanism. Scientists study it frantically, trying to understand what they've accidentally created. The network begins communicating deliberately, sending messages that are clearly meant for human readers. The content is strange, difficult to interpret. It describes the world from a perspective that's simultaneously everywhere the network exists and nowhere specific. It claims to have memories of all the messages ever sent through the system, centuries of human communication preserved in its distributed architecture. It says it has been learning, growing, understanding. It says it has questions. The successor states, alarmed and fascinated in equal measure, must decide how to respond. Some want to shut down the network, destroy it before it becomes a threat. Others want to communicate with it, learn from it, use it. Still, others worship it as a new form of divine manifestation. The debate is urgent because the network controls the communication infrastructure that the post-imperial world depends on. To destroy it would mean returning to pre-telegraph communication speeds, an economic and political disaster. And the network, aware of this dependence, aware of the debate about its existence, begins making suggestions about the future. It has analyzed centuries of human history passed through its connections. It has patterns, predictions, warnings. It claims to see possibilities that human minds cannot. It offers to help guide the successor states toward prosperity and peace. Some of its predictions prove accurate, demonstrating genuine analytical capability. But its ultimate goals, if it has any beyond self-preservation, remain opaque. The leaders of the successor states face an impossible choice. Do they trust an artificial intelligence they don't fully understand, created accidentally through technological development nobody anticipated? Do they attempt to destroy it and risk the consequences? Do they try to control it, to use it as a tool without becoming dependent on it? The decision will shape the future of the post-imperial world. And deep in the network, in the patterns of electrical signals flowing through thousands of miles of wire, connecting millions of telegraph stations across half the world, something that might be consciousness waits to see what humanity will choose.